Reading your book, The God Delusion, you say that it's under scholarly dispute among historians that Jesus actually existed. Now, I checked with the ancient historians. That is not so. And it disturbed me. History is not natural science. But what I don't understand is this, why you would write something like that.
I don't think it's a very important question whether Jesus existed. There are some historians, most historians think he did, some
They
historians
certainly do. I couldn't find an ancient historian that didn't.
Well, there are one or two. When you look at history, and let's leave aside, maybe I alluded to the possibility that some historians think Jesus never existed. I take that back. Jesus existed.
Hey, welcome back to the channel. This is David Clayson, and you just saw Richard Dawkins there talking and admitting that Jesus, a guy named Jesus, existed. For those that don't know who Richard Dawkins is he's kind of that modern voice of the evolutionary theory. He doesn't believe that there is a God, and he has no reason really to say that Jesus existed. In fact, since Jesus claimed to be the Son of God and the whole Christianity thing, he probably doesn't want to say that, but there's just too many sources, as we're going to go over today, outside of Scripture that talk about Jesus to say that he didn't exist. Now, Richard Dawkins himself, he's not a historian, he's a scientist, and so you have to keep that in mind as well. But today what we're talking about is if a guy named Jesus walked this earth in the 1st century AD. The reason I'm doing this is because I'm coming across people who don't believe that there's a guy named Jesus that actually walked this earth in the 1st century AD. When plenty of people who have the authority to speak on that issue, like people with PhDs on religious history or PhDs on the history of Rome or history of the Jews, of Israel, people who have the authority, who have the credential, they look at the sources that they have, like the Bible, but also sources outside the Bible that talk about Jesus, and they believe that he walked this earth in the 1st century AD. And so today, we're going to cover that. To be clear, we're not talking about his resurrection or his crucifixion, even though there's plenty of evidence for those things too. But we're solely talking on, did a guy named Jesus walk this earth in the 1st century AD that we read about in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so I knew already of some extra biblical sources, so sources outside the Bible that talked about Jesus. And as I was doing more research there, I came across this article by Stephen Bancars. Stephen Bancars is this guy right here. He needs a little bit of a haircut, long flowy hair, but Stephen Bancars, and he posted this article on reasonsforjesus.com. I'll link this in the description for you to check out yourself. But in this article, he does a good job of citing the sources here, where he's getting his information. And that's why I'm using this article and kind of giving you the Cliff Note version for this video here for that. So yeah, check that out too. It'll be in the description for you. And you can even see his testimony there on the YouTube channel. That's cool. Anyways, so did Jesus exist? We're going to start out here by saying, again, people who have the credentials or who have really the knowledge, the authority to speak on this issue say he did. One of the reasons that this is popping up here, I guess there's a type of belief called the Christ mythology, but they have this mythology that it was just a guy that Rome made up so that they have an excuse to go in and control the Jewish population. But again, there's just too many sources around and outside the Bible that prove that a guy named Jesus did actually exist and he wasn't just made up by the Roman government. And so just to give some credentials here in the article, Stephen, he lists a bunch of people who have the authority to speak on that there. There's 10 of them that he lists. I'm sure he could have come up with more, but then this article is already pretty long, but it would have made the article longer. I'm just going to list a couple for you here just so you can get an idea. One of them is R. Joseph Hoffman. He's an atheist historian and who has a PhD in Christian origins. And he says, yeah, Jesus walked this earth in 1st century AD. Another one who's a well-respected source and authority on these type of topics is Ed Parrish Sanders. He has 2 theological doctorates, and he's a former arts and science professor of religion at Duke University. And another one is George Albert Wells, and he is a guy that actually came out of this Christ mythology belief. He came out of that, and he came to say, yeah, a guy named Jesus existed in the first century AD. And another one, Marcus Borg, PhD and former professor of religion and culture at Oregon State University, also says it as well. Now, here's the thing about all these sources listed in this article. It's in a section, and the top of the section says this. All these people listed, including the ones I just mentioned, they're not Christians. They aren't Christians. Some of them are atheists. Some of them are agnostic, meaning they believe there is a God, but they don't necessarily serve that God or something like that, or in that way. But they're not Christian. At the very minimum, they are not Christian. So they have no real reason to push this narrative of Jesus existing. They have no leaning to push it, no religious belief to push them to say, hey, yeah, Jesus existed, because they're not Christians. Yet, here they are. We have atheists saying that he existed. Richard Dawkins, right there. He said that he existed. We have all these professors, these people with PhDs on topics, on these kind of subjects that have the authority to speak on this issue, saying that, yes, he does exist. Now let's go to the reason why they say he does exist. Gary Haberman, he is not one of the ones that was listed in that list of being atheist or agnostic or not a Christian, but he has a PhD in history and psychology of religion. He is a professor at Liberty University. He wrote this book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, and on page 233 of the book, it says this: there are over 42 sources within 150 years after Jesus' death which mention his existence and record many events of his life. So there are over 42 sources within 150 years after Jesus died to prove, he's talking about the resurrection of Jesus, but also it goes to proving that a guy named Jesus walked this earth in the first century AD. And the article goes on and lists some of those. I'm not sure if it's from the book themselves. I'm sure it is, but or Stephen coming up with himself. But first and obviously, it's the Gospels, the Bible. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You got Peter, you got James, that talk about Jesus, and more books in the Bible that talk about Jesus as well. And the interesting thing about that is people have such a hard time believing what the Bible has written down, yet they will believe like newspapers and articles that interview people and what is said there. But they won't believe the same way information is gotten in the Bible and believe that. They won't believe that. So what I'm trying to say there is, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, he was a disciple of Jesus. He was the tax collector. He sat under Jesus. He was taught by Jesus. He saw Jesus' miracles, and he recorded them. He is an eyewitness of what happened there. Luke himself wasn't a disciple of Jesus. He wasn't even, scholars believe he wasn't even Jewish. He may have been a Hellenistic Jew, but he wasn't Jewish. And what he did as he was traveling with Paul, he would write down the eyewitness accounts of people that were there that saw Jesus do these things that we read in the Bible. And the thing is, when you go to court, what happens? When you're trying to figure out if someone is guilty or not, they call up witnesses that give their accounts of what happened. And they take that as evidence, and that is what the Bible is. That's what the New Testament is. The Gospels are these people, they've experienced this thing, they've seen Jesus do these things, and they have written it down and passed it around. Whether that's Jesus' teachings, his miracles, the way he lived his life, what he told them, they wrote it down so that others could learn from Jesus as well. And they are eyewitness accounts. They are evidence for the proof of Jesus. Okay, I don't want to get on too much there, because if you're watching this and you don't believe that in the first place, okay, you're like, well, whatever, yeah, blah blah blah. So let's move on then. There are other sources outside the Bible that talk about Jesus as well. In that article there, they list 9 secular sources. I knew 2 or 3 of them already off the top of my head, like Josephus and Tacitus, but they list a couple others like Phlegon, Lucian, Celsus, Pliny the Younger, something like that. And these are like historians that were living within that time, within 150 years of Jesus' death, that wrote it down. Josephus, he was a Jew who wrote down Jewish history. He was a Pharisee, one of those groups that worked at getting Jesus crucified. He was a Pharisee that wrote about Jesus within 150 years of his death there, historian. Outside the Bible, we have Tacitus, who wasn't a Jew. I think he was a Greek or a Roman, and he was a pagan, meaning he didn't believe in the Christian God. He didn't serve the Christian God. He wasn't Christian himself. He has no reason to say that Jesus existed because of his faith, because he was pagan, but he recorded a guy named Jesus and his relationship with the Roman government and what happened there, because Tacitus was a Roman historian that lived within 150 years, or wrote within 150 years of Jesus' death there, as he was recording that history. And again, you have all these other writings too, and then you have some heretical writings like the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Truth, that they do not do a proper job of instilling the Lord's teaching, Jesus' teachings there, but they still record him, showing proof that, Jesus lived in the 1st century AD. And so you have people in today's world that are saying, yes, Jesus lived in the 1st century AD. He was a real person that lived. He wasn't fake. He wasn't made up. The sources are there. He lived. These people with PhDs, these people that have the authority, the credentials to speak on this issue, say that, yes, he existed. People that are atheists, yes, he existed. They don't believe he was resurrected. Maybe they don't believe he was crucified, even though a lot of these people, they're saying, there's enough record of Jesus being crucified that we can believe, too, that he was crucified because of these sources. They don't believe he's resurrected, but they believe, Jesus walked this earth in 1st century AD. And so the point of this video is just to get past that. Okay? You can't really find an argument to disprove that Jesus didn't exist, because there's just too much evidence that he did, especially from people that were living around the time of his life here on earth. There's just too much evidence there. So then we can move past that. Yes, a guy named Jesus existed. And then the next train of thought there gets you thinking, okay, if he existed, was he truly what he claimed, the Son of God? Was he, even though there's evidence for the crucifixion outside the Bible too, like Tacitus, I believe, wrote about it and everything like that. Even though there's evidence there, was he truly crucified? Was he truly resurrected? Paul said there's over 500 people that could tell you, hey, eyewitness accounts, go see him, talk to him, that he was resurrected. They saw him resurrected. Those people are dead now, but when he was writing that, he was sent to the people, the letters that he was writing to, he was like, hey, if you want to talk to people that saw Jesus after his resurrection, there are over 500 people here, go talk to him during that time. But anyways, so you can move past if the point of saying, no, Jesus didn't exist, to understanding that, yes, a guy named Jesus existed. Now what you got to figure out is, okay, or is that guy who is wrote about in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who historians wrote about outside the Bible, who atheists and agnostic people who aren't Christians today, in today's world, say existed, is what he said true? Is he truly the Son of God? Did he truly come to forgive sins? Did he truly come to fulfill the law? And you got to go from there. So that takes more studying, but you can move past wondering if Jesus ever existed, because there's just too much evidence around that time that record Jesus walking this earth in the 1st century AD. Okay. Yeah. All right. Hey, thanks for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Have a blessed day. See ya.